Hello and welcome back. Today, we will learn English through the extraordinary story of Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who conquered much of Europe, a ruler who changed laws, governments, and history itself, a leader admired by millions and feared by millions more. But this story does not begin with an emperor. It begins with a prisoner, far from France, far from power, far from the cheering crowds that once celebrated his victories, on a small island called St. Helena. Surrounded by the endless Atlantic Ocean, a lonely man sat and looked back on his life. There were no great armies around him, no royal ceremonies, no victories waiting ahead, only memories of battles, memories of triumph, and memories of mistakes. Just a few years earlier, this same man had been the most powerful ruler in Europe. Kings feared him, generals studied him, entire nations changed because of his decisions. Yet now, he was alone. How could a man rise so high and fall so far? How did a boy from a small island become Emperor of France? Why did millions follow him? And why did the empire he built collapse around him? The answers begin long before the battles, long before the crown, long before the glory. They begin on a rugged island in the Mediterranean Sea, a place called Corsica. There, a quiet boy was growing up, a boy who often felt like an outsider, a boy who was mocked for the way he spoke, a boy who dreamed of becoming something greater. That boy's name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and he was about to begin one of the most remarkable journeys in human history. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769. His home was Corsica, a rugged island in the Mediterranean Sea. Today, Corsica is part of France, but when Napoleon was born, the situation was complicated. Many people on the island did not feel truly French. They had their own traditions, their own identity, and their own pride. Napoleon grew up in a family that was respected, but not wealthy. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer. His mother, Letizia, was strong, disciplined, and demanding. She taught her children an important lesson. Life would not give them success. They would have to earn it from an early age. Napoleon seemed different from other children. He was serious, quiet, and often lost in his own thoughts. While many boys enjoyed games and celebrations, Napoleon preferred books. He loved history. He loved stories about great leaders, and he admired people who changed the world through intelligence and determination. But his life changed dramatically. When he was only 9 years old, his father sent him to France to study. For the young boy, it was a journey into a completely different world. The language sounded different. The culture felt unfamiliar, and the people did not always welcome him at school. Napoleon quickly discovered that he was an outsider. He spoke French with a strong Corsican accent. His clothes were simple. His family was not rich. Many students came from powerful families. Some laughed at him. Some mocked the way he spoke. Others treated him as if he did not belong. For a young boy, the experience was painful. Many people in the same situation would have become discouraged. Some would have given up. Napoleon chose a different path. Instead of seeking popularity, he focused on learning. Instead of arguing with those who mocked him, he spent more time reading. Books became his refuge. His teachers noticed something unusual. Napoleon was not the most charming student. He was not the most social, but he possessed remarkable concentration. When he became interested in a subject, he studied it obsessively. Mathematics fascinated him. Geography fascinated him. Military history fascinated him most of all. He read about Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Hannibal, Charlemagne. Again and again, he asked himself the same question. What made these men extraordinary? How did they rise above everyone else? And slowly, another question began to form in his mind. Why could he not do the same? The loneliness he experienced at school, created something powerful inside him, a desire to prove himself, a desire to show the world that he was not inferior, that he belonged among the great figures of history. Years later, people would see Napoleon as confident, fearless, almost unstoppable, but beneath that confidence was a boy who had spent years feeling different, a boy who had learned to rely on himself, a boy who believed that success was the only way to earn respect, and soon, history would give him an opportunity that almost nobody could have imagined, because while Napoleon was studying and dreaming, France itself was moving toward a crisis that would destroy the old world and create the perfect opening for a young officer with enormous ambition. By the late 1780s, France was in trouble. The country was rich, but many of its people were poor. Food was expensive, jobs were difficult to find, and ordinary families were struggling to survive. Meanwhile, the king and the nobility continued to live in luxury. Many people felt the system was unfair. Their frustration grew year after year. Eventually, that frustration exploded. In 1789, the French Revolution began. The old order started to collapse. Protests filled the streets. Crowds demanded change. The authority of the king weakened, and uncertainty spread throughout the country. For many people, the revolution was frightening. For Napoleon, it was an opportunity. At the time, he was a young artillery officer. He had intelligence, training, and ambition, but under the old system, advancement was slow. Important positions often went to people with powerful families. Now everything was changing. The revolution created chaos, and chaos often creates openings for those who can act quickly. Napoleon understood this. While others hesitated, he paid attention. He studied events carefully. He watched political leaders rise and fall, and he waited for his moment. That moment arrived in 1793. The southern French city of Toulon had rebelled against the revolutionary government. Worse still, British forces had entered the city. The government needed military leaders who could solve the problem. Napoleon proposed a bold plan. Instead of attacking the city directly, he identified key positions that controlled the harbor. If those positions were captured, the British fleet would be forced to leave. The plan worked. The city was retaken. The British withdrew. And suddenly, people began talking about a young officer named Napoleon Bonaparte. For the first time, he attracted national attention. Promotions followed. Responsibilities increased. His reputation grew, but France remained unstable. Political factions fought each other. Governments rose and collapsed. Executions became common. Fear spread across the country. The revolution that promised freedom had also unleashed violence. Napoleon watched everything carefully. He learned an important lesson. Power did not belong to those with the best intentions. Power belonged to those who could seize and hold it. Then, in 1795, another opportunity appeared. A royalist uprising threatened the government in Paris. The situation was dangerous. The authorities needed someone willing to act decisively. Napoleon accepted the task. He moved artillery into position. When the rebels advanced, he ordered his troops to fire. The uprising was crushed. The government survived, and Napoleon became a hero. Many people praised him for saving the revolution. Others criticized the violence, but one fact was impossible to ignore. The young outsider from Corsica was rising rapidly. At only 26 years old, he had become one of the most promising military leaders in France. His years of study were paying off. His ambition was carrying him forward, and soon he would be given an army of his own, an army that would change his life forever, because beyond the mountains of France lay Italy, and there, Napoleon would begin the campaign that made him famous across Europe. In 1796, Napoleon received the opportunity he had been waiting for. The French government placed him in command of the Army of Italy. It sounded impressive, but there was a problem. The army was in terrible condition. Many soldiers were hungry, some lacked proper equipment. Others had not been paid for months. Morale was low, confidence was low, and few people expected great results. When Napoleon arrived, he immediately addressed his troops. His message was simple. You are hungry and poorly supplied. I will lead you into the richest plains in the world. There you will find honor, glory, and wealth. The soldiers listened. Many had heard promises before, but Napoleon spoke with unusual confidence. More importantly, he acted unlike many commanders. He moved quickly, very quickly. Instead of fighting large enemy forces all at once, he attacked smaller groups separately, again and again. Before his enemies could unite, Napoleon struck. The results were astonishing. Victory followed victory. Within months, the young general transformed a struggling army into one of the most effective fighting forces in Europe. His soldiers began to admire him. His enemies began to fear him. His name spread across the continent. People who had never met Napoleon were suddenly discussing him. Who was this young commander? How was he defeating armies larger than his own? What made him different? Part of the answer was speed. Napoleon believed that hesitation was dangerous. While other generals debated, he acted. While others planned for weeks, he moved within days. He understood that confusion was often more powerful than numbers. If he moved fast enough, his opponents never had time to react. But military success was only part of the story. Napoleon also understood something about human psychology. He knew soldiers fought harder when they believed they were part of something important. So he constantly spoke about glory, victory, history, destiny. He made ordinary soldiers feel extraordinary, and they followed him almost anywhere. By the end of the Italian campaign, Napoleon was no longer just a successful officer. He was a national hero. Newspapers celebrated him. Citizens admired him. Politicians watched him carefully, and that worried some people because Napoleon was becoming more popular than the government itself. Soon, another mission was proposed, a mission far from Europe, a mission that seemed impossible: Egypt. Napoleon believed Egypt could strengthen France. It could weaken Britain's influence, and perhaps open a path toward even greater ambitions. In 1798, he sailed for North Africa. Thousands of soldiers followed him. The world watched with curiosity, but Egypt would teach Napoleon an important lesson. A man can win battle after battle, yet still discover that victory has limits. When Napoleon returned from Egypt, France was in trouble again. The revolution had removed the king, but it had not created stability. Governments came and went. Political leaders argued constantly. Corruption was growing. The economy was struggling, and many French citizens were losing faith in their leaders. The country was tired of chaos, tired of uncertainty, tired of endless political conflict. Napoleon understood the situation immediately. He saw something that many others missed. People were no longer asking for more revolution. They were asking for order, and order was something Napoleon believed he could provide. Binot. He was one of the most famous men in France. Soldiers admired him. Citizens respected him. Many politicians feared him. His popularity had become a source of power. Then, in 1799, an opportunity appeared. Several influential political figures approached Napoleon. They wanted to remove the weak government. They needed someone strong enough to make it happen. Napoleon agreed. The plan moved quickly. Meetings were arranged. Troops were positioned. Political opponents were pressured. Within days, the existing government collapsed. A new government took its place. History would later call it the coup of 18 Brumaire. For Napoleon, it was a turning point. He was no longer simply a general. He was now the most powerful political figure in France. Officially, France was still a republic. Officially, power was shared, but everyone understood the reality. Napoleon was in charge. Many people accepted the change after years of instability. They wanted a leader who could make decisions, a leader who could restore confidence, a leader who could bring peace. At first, Napoleon focused on rebuilding the country. He improved government administration, he strengthened public finances, he supported education, he encouraged economic growth, roads were repaired, institutions became more efficient. Slowly, France became more stable, but Napoleon wanted more than stability. He wanted permanence. He wanted his achievements to survive long after he was gone. One of his most important accomplishments was the creation of the Napoleonic Code, a new legal system, clearer, more organized, more consistent. For millions of people, these laws shaped daily life. In fact, parts of the Napoleonic Code would influence legal systems around the world for generations. This was something different from military victory. Battles could be forgotten, empires could collapse, but laws could survive, and many of Napoleon's laws did. As his influence grew, so did his confidence. Soon, the question was no longer whether Napoleon ruled France. The question was what title he would give himself. Then, in 1804, he made a decision that shocked Europe. He would become emperor, not because he inherited a throne, not because he belonged to an ancient royal family, but because he believed he had earned it. The outsider from Corsica was about to place a crown upon his own head, and with that single act, he would change the course of European history. Napoleon had achieved more than most people thought possible. He had risen from a small island in the Mediterranean. He had become a military hero. He had taken control of France. He had restored stability to a nation exhausted by revolution. But Napoleon was not satisfied. He wanted something greater. He wanted legitimacy. He wanted permanence. He wanted history to remember him not as a temporary ruler, but as the founder of a new era. So preparations began for a grand ceremony. The location was Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, one of the most famous churches in Europe. Nobles arrived, generals arrived, foreign diplomats arrived. The Pope himself traveled from Rome to attend. The event was designed to send a message. France was no longer controlled by kings of the old world. France now belonged to Napoleon. On December 2, 1804, the cathedral filled with spectators. Everyone waited for the most important moment. Traditionally, a ruler would kneel. The Pope would place the crown upon his head. That was how kings had been crowned for centuries. But Napoleon had other ideas. As the moment approached, he stepped forward. He took the crown into his own hands. The entire cathedral watched in silence. Then Napoleon placed the crown on his own head. The message was unmistakable. His authority did not come from the church. It did not come from an ancient royal family. It came from himself, from his achievements, from his power, from his belief in his own destiny. Soon afterward, he crowned his wife, Josephine, as Empress. The ceremony was magnificent, but it also revealed something important about Napoleon. Confidence had become certainty, and certainty was becoming ambition on an entirely new scale. Across Europe, monarchs watched with concern. Many had tolerated Napoleon as a general. Some had accepted him as a political leader. An emperor was different. An emperor represented a challenge, a threat, a man who might reshape the balance of power across the continent. Their fears were justified because Napoleon was not planning to defend his empire. He was planning to expand it. In the years that followed, coalition after coalition formed against France. Austria, Russia, Britain, Prussia, again and again. Europe's great powers joined forces, again and again. Napoleon defeated them. His armies moved with extraordinary speed. His strategies confused his enemies. His confidence inspired his soldiers. Victory followed victory. At Austerlitz, he defeated 2 emperors in a single campaign. Many historians still consider it his greatest military masterpiece. His reputation reached legendary status. To his supporters, Napoleon seemed unstoppable. To his enemies, he seemed dangerous. To himself, he may have seemed destined for greatness. And that was where the real danger began. Because success can change a person, the more Napoleon won, the more he believed he could not lose, the more Europe surrendered, the more he wanted to control. The empire grew larger, the victories grew greater, and the risks grew bigger. Soon, Napoleon would stand at the height of his power, master of much of Europe, feared by kings, admired by soldiers, and convinced that his future held even greater triumphs. But history was already preparing a different ending. Far to the east lay a vast empire, an empire too large to intimidate, too powerful to control, and too cold to conquer. Its name was Russia. By 1812, Napoleon stood at the height of his power. His empire stretched across much of Europe. Kings obeyed him. Allies depended on him. Enemies feared him. From the outside, he appeared unstoppable, but beneath the surface, problems were growing. One of the largest was Russia. At first, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I had cooperated. Both men were powerful. Both men were ambitious. But over time, their relationship began to deteriorate. Disagreements increased. Trust disappeared. Eventually, Napoleon reached a decision. He would invade Russia. Many people warned him to be careful. Russia was enormous. Its distances were vast. Its climate was unforgiving. But Napoleon believed speed and discipline could overcome any obstacle. After all, they always had before. So, in June 1812, he assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen. More than 600,000 soldiers. French troops, Polish troops, German troops, Italian troops, men from across the empire. It was a breathtaking force. Napoleon believed one decisive campaign would force Russia to surrender. At first, everything seemed to go according to plan. The army crossed into Russian territory. But something strange happened. The Russians refused to fight a major battle. Instead, they retreated again and again and again. Each time Napoleon advanced, the Russians moved farther away. As they withdrew, they destroyed supplies, they burned crops, they burned villages, they burned anything that might help the invading army. The farther Napoleon marched, the longer his supply lines became. Food became harder to find, horses weakened, soldiers grew exhausted, yet Napoleon continued forward. He was determined to force a victory. Finally, near Borodino, the Russians stood and fought. The battle was brutal. Thousands died. The battlefield became a scene of unimaginable destruction. When the fighting ended, Napoleon remained in control. Technically, he had won, but it was not the victory he needed. The Russian army still existed. It had not been destroyed, and it continued retreating. Soon, Napoleon reached Moscow. The city was the heart of Russia. Many expected the war to end there. Instead, Napoleon found something shocking. The city was nearly empty. Most residents had already left. Then fires broke out. Large sections of Moscow burned. Napoleon waited for a peace offer. Non came. Days passed, then weeks. Still nothing. For perhaps the first time in his career, he found himself trapped by uncertainty. Winter was approaching, supplies were running low, and Russia refused to surrender. Finally, Napoleon made the decision he had hoped to avoid: retreat. The journey back became a nightmare. Temperatures plunged. Snow covered the roads. Food disappeared. Men froze to death. Horses collapsed. Disease spread. The army that had entered Russia with more than 600,000 men slowly disintegrated. Every day brought new suffering. Every mile brought new losses. By the time the survivors escaped Russia, only a fraction remained. The greatest army in Europe had been shattered. The consequences were enormous. Across the continent, Napoleon's enemies watched carefully. For years, they had feared him. Now they saw something different. They saw weakness. They saw vulnerability. For the first time in many years, they believed Napoleon could be defeated, and they were preparing to prove it. The disaster in Russia changed everything. For years, Napoleon had seemed invincible. Now the illusion was gone. Across Europe, old enemies saw an opportunity. Russia was ready to continue the fight. Prussia joined the struggle. Austria joined as well. Britain continued its support. On the Beaune, nations united against France. They understood something important. If they fought separately, Napoleon could defeat them. If they fought together, they might finally stop him. Napoleon knew the danger, and despite the catastrophe in Russia, he refused to surrender. He worked tirelessly. He raised new armies. He trained new soldiers. And once again, he entered the battlefield. His skill had not disappeared. His determination had not weakened. Even after losing so much, he continued winning battles. But this time was different. Many of his most experienced soldiers were gone. Many trusted officers were gone. The empire no longer possessed the strength it once had. Each victory became more expensive. Each defeat became more dangerous. Then, in 1813, the decisive campaign began. The largest battle of the Napoleonic Wars took place near Leipzig in Germany. Today it is known as the Battle of Nations. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers participated. The scale was enormous. Napoleon fought with all the brilliance he still possessed, but numbers were against him. The coalition armies continued, growing stronger. Eventually, France was forced to retreat. For the first time, Napoleon was being pushed backward, not forward. Backward. The momentum that had carried him for years was disappearing. Soon, enemy armies crossed into France itself. The war was no longer happening in distant lands. It had reached his doorstep. Cities became anxious. Citizens became fearful. The empire that Napoleon had built was beginning to crack. In 1814, coalition forces entered Paris. The capital had fallen. The situation was hopeless. Many of Napoleon's closest supporters urged him to step down. At first, he resisted. He had spent his entire life fighting. Giving up felt impossible, but reality could no longer be ignored. Eventually, Napoleon abdicated. The Emperor of France surrendered his throne. The man who had ruled much of Europe lost everything. Or so it seemed. The victorious powers decided not to execute him. Instead, they sent him into exile. His destination was a small Mediterranean island called Elba. Ironically, it was not much larger than the island where his story had begun. For the first time in decades, Napoleon had no empire, no great army, no battlefield, no throne. Many believed his story was over. Many believed history had reached its conclusion. They were wrong, because Napoleon Bonaparte was not a man who accepted endings easily. On Elba, he watched events in France carefully. He listened, he waited, and he realized something. Many people were unhappy. The new government lacked his authority. The new rulers lacked his charisma. The legend of Napoleon was still alive. Then, in 1815, he made one of the most daring decisions of his life. He escaped, and he sailed back to France. The world could hardly believe it. The emperor had returned. When Napoleon escaped from Elba, Europe was stunned. Most people thought they would never hear from him again. Most believed his political career was finished. But Napoleon believed otherwise. In February 1815, he landed on the southern coast of France. He did not arrive with a massive army. He did not arrive with thousands of soldiers. He arrived with only a small group of loyal followers. The situation seemed hopeless. The French government immediately sent troops to stop him. Their orders were clear: arrest Napoleon, end the threat, prevent his return to power. Soon, soldiers blocked his path. The moment was critical. A single gunshot could have changed history. Napoleon stepped forward alone. He walked toward the soldiers, calmly, confidently, without fear. Then he opened his coat and spoke. "If any man among you wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." The soldiers stood in silence. For a few moments, nobody moved. Then something extraordinary happened. Instead of arresting him, many joined him. Some shouted his name. Others threw their hats into the air. The troops sent to stop Napoleon became part of his growing army. As he marched toward Paris, support increased. City after city welcomed him. Soldiers switched sides. Citizens gathered to watch. The legend had returned. Meanwhile, King Louis XVIII realized the danger. As Napoleon approached the capital, the king fled. Without firing a single shot, Napoleon entered Paris. Once again, he was ruler of France. The comeback seemed unbelievable. Historians would later call this period the 100 Days. But Napoleon understood the truth. His position was fragile. The powers of Europe would never accept his return. Already, armies were preparing. Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia. They united once again. This time, their goal was simple: end Napoleon forever. The emperor knew he could not wait. If he allowed the coalition armies to gather, France would be overwhelmed. So he decided to strike first. In June 1815, Napoleon marched north into Belgium. His objective was clear: defeat his enemies separately before they could unite. It was the same strategy that had brought him victory many times before. And at first, it seemed to be working, but Napoleon was no longer the young commander of Italy. His enemies had learned from years of war. They understood his methods, and they were ready. Soon, near a small village called Waterloo, one final battle would begin. A battle that would decide Napoleon's future. A battle that would decide the future of Europe. And unlike all the battles before it, there would be no second chance. In June 1815, Napoleon marched into Belgium. He knew time was running out. The coalition armies were gathering. If they united, France would face overwhelming force. Napoleon's only hope was to defeat them separately. It was a strategy that had worked many times before, but Waterloo would be different. The battlefield lay near a small village in present-day Belgium. There, the Duke of Wellington commanded a British-led army. Another army, led by the Prussian commander Blücher, was moving nearby. Napoleon needed a quick victory before the Prussians could arrive, before the two armies could join forces. On the morning of June 18, heavy rain covered the battlefield. The ground was soaked. Mud slowed the movement of soldiers and artillery. Napoleon delayed his attack. He hoped the ground would dry. Every hour mattered, and every hour gave his enemies more time. When the battle finally began, French forces attacked repeatedly. The fighting was fierce. Fields turned into chaos. Smoke filled the air. Cannons thundered across the countryside. Thousands of men fought for survival. At first, neither side gained a decisive advantage. Wellington's army absorbed wave after wave of attacks. The British commander remained calm. His soldiers held their positions again and again. Napoleon searched for the breakthrough that had won him so many victories in the past, but it never came. As the day continued, another danger appeared. In the distance, new troops were approaching. At first, there was uncertainty. Who were they? Friends or enemies? Soon the answer became clear. The Prussians had arrived. Blücher's army entered the battle. Now Napoleon faced exactly what he had hoped to avoid. Två armés att onsa. The pressure became overwhelming. French soldiers continued fighting bravely, but exhaustion was spreading. Losses were mounting. The situation worsened with every passing hour. Then came the final collapse. French units began retreating. The retreat became confusion. The confusion became panic. The panic became defeat. For the first time in many years, Napoleon's army was completely broken. The battle was over. Waterloo had ended his last chance. When news spread across Europe, the reaction was immediate. Everyone understood the significance. Napoleon was finished. This time, there would be no return, no escape, no second empire, no miracle. Soon afterward, Napoleon surrendered to the British. The man who had once ruled much of Europe was now a prisoner. The journey that began on the island of Corsica had reached its final chapter, but one final destination still awaited him. A lonely island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, a place from which there would be no return. After Waterloo, Napoleon's story was finally coming to an end. The governments of Europe had learned an important lesson. Elba had been a mistake. The island was too close, too easy to escape, too connected to Europe. This time, they chose a very different destination, St. Helena, a tiny island in the South Atlantic Ocean, thousands of kilometers from Europe, thousands of kilometers from France, thousands of kilometers from power. It was one of the most isolated places in the world. There would be no dramatic return, no loyal army waiting nearby, no second chance. When Napoleon arrived, he understood the reality immediately. His empire was gone. His armies were gone. His political career was over. For a man who had spent most of his life moving, conquering, and commanding, the silence was difficult. The days became predictable. The routines became repetitive. Instead of reviewing battle plans, he took walks. Instead of speaking to generals, he spoke with a small group of companions. Instead of ruling Europe, he reflected on the past. Sometimes he discussed his campaigns. Sometimes he talked about politics. Sometimes he spoke about history. And sometimes he defended his decisions. Napoleon knew that future generations would judge him. He wanted to influence that judgment. He wanted people to remember his victories, his reforms, his achievements, not only his defeats. During these years, he spent considerable time dictating memories of his life, stories of battles, stories of leaders, stories of the choices that shaped Europe. In many ways, Napoleon was fighting one final campaign, not on a battlefield, but in history itself. He wanted control over his legacy, yet time continued. Moving forward, his health slowly declined. Some days were better than others. Some days were difficult. The energetic young officer from Corsica no longer existed. The brilliant commander of Italy no longer existed. The emperor who crowned himself in Paris no longer existed. Only Napoleon remained, a man looking back on an extraordinary life. Years passed. The world continued changing. New leaders emerged. New conflicts appeared. But on St. Helena, life grew quieter. Then, in 1821, his condition worsened significantly. The man who had survived countless battles was becoming weaker. Doctors tried to help. Friends remained close. But everyone understood what was happening. The end was approaching. Unmöglich. 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died. He was 51 years old. The boy from Corsica, the outsider, the general, the emperor, the exile. His journey was over, yet something remarkable happened. Although Napoleon died on a remote island, his story did not disappear. In fact, it was only beginning, because death ended the man, but it could not end the legend. More than 2 centuries have passed since Napoleon's death. Empires have risen, empires have fallen, borders have changed, governments have disappeared, yet Napoleon Bonaparte remains one of the most recognized names in history. Why? The answer is not as simple as many people think. It is not only because of his victories. It is not only because of his battles, and it is not only because he became emperor. Many conquerors have existed throughout history. Most are eventually forgotten. Napoleon was different. He changed the way nations were governed. He changed the way armies were organized. And perhaps most importantly, he changed the way ordinary people thought about opportunity. Before the French Revolution, power often belonged to those born into the right family, the right title, the right social class. Napoleon represented something different. He was not born a king. He was not born an emperor. He built his position through talent, ambition, and relentless effort. That idea inspired millions of people, even those who disagreed with him, even those who fought against him. Another reason for his lasting influence was the Napoleonic Code. Many people have never heard of it, yet its impact can still be seen today. The code helped create clearer and more consistent laws. It promoted equality before the law. It reduced many old privileges that had benefited only a small group of people. As French influence spread across Europe, these ideas spread as well. Long after Napoleon disappeared, parts of his legal system remained. His armies conquered territory, but his laws conquered time. Yet Napoleon's story is not only a story of success, it is also a warning. He teaches us something about ambition. Ambition can be powerful. It can help people overcome obstacles. It can transform dreams into reality. Without ambition, Napoleon might have remained an unknown officer. Without ambition, he would never have changed history. But ambition can also become dangerous. It can create the illusion that every victory must be followed by another, that every achievement is only the beginning, that enough is never enough. Perhaps this was Napoleon's greatest weakness. He conquered Italy, then he wanted more. He conquered much of Europe, then he wanted more. He became emperor, then he wanted more. Eventually, the desire for more led him to Russia, and Russia changed everything. In the end, Napoleon was defeated by the very force that had helped him rise, his own ambition. That is why historians continue to debate him. Was he a hero? Was he a tyrant? Was he a genius? Was he a warning? The truth may be all of those things at once, because history's most fascinating people are rarely simple. And Napoleon Bonaparte was anything but simple. He lived an extraordinary life. He made extraordinary achievements, and he made extraordinary mistakes. That combination is what transformed a boy from Corsica into a legend remembered around the world. Bonus épilogue. The Return of the Emperor. Napoleon died on St. Helena in 1821. At the time, many believed his story was finally over, but history had one more surprise. For nearly 20 years, his body remained on the remote island. Meanwhile, in France, public opinion slowly began to change. Many people still remembered his victories. Many still remembered the glory of the empire, and many believed Napoleon deserved to return home. Then, in 1840, the French government made a decision. A special mission was sent to St. Helena. Its purpose was simple: bring Napoleon back to France. When his remains arrived in Paris, enormous crowds gathered. People lined the streets. Thousands came to watch. Years after his death, Napoleon still inspired powerful emotions. Some admired him, some criticized him, but almost nobody ignored him. Eventually, his remains were placed in Les Invalides in Paris. There they remain today. Visitors from around the world continue to come and see the tomb of the man who once ruled much of Europe. This tells us something remarkable. Most people are remembered by their families. Some are remembered by their communities. A few are remembered by their countries. But only a very small number are remembered by the world. Napoleon became one of those people, not because he lived a perfect life, not because he always made the right decisions, but because he left a mark on history that could not be erased. More than 200 years later, students still study him, historians still debate him, writers still write about him, and ordinary people still ask the same question: what would have happened if Napoleon had stopped? After his greatest victories, we will never know. But perhaps that mystery is one reason his story continues to fascinate us today.